On April the 2nd, the FDA rejected the application for the approval of ALKS 5461, a new antidepressant medication made by the pharmaceutical company Alkermes. Now, this is actually kind of a big deal because just a couple of years ago, a lot of people thought that this medication was going to be a big breakthrough for the treatment of depression, and certainly it's a big blow to Alkermes. This drug was expected to be Alkermes' biggest selling medication so far, and they had actually just recently increased their sales staff by 70% in anticipation that this drug was going to be approved. Part of the reason why Alkermes was so confident that ALKS 5461 would make a lot of money for them is the depression market is a very big market. There are a lot of people that suffer from depression and major depressive disorder, and the current antidepressants available are not particularly effective. According to some research, the majority of the time when people take an antidepressant, they have an inadequate response to it. So the market for an antidepressant that is actually effective is very large. The thing about ALKS 5461 is it's different from other antidepressants on the market because it is actually an opioid. It combines buprenorphine with samidorphan. Buprenorphine is an opioid modulator that is currently used for the treatment of opioid dependence. It itself is considered addictive, but it is used as a substitution for other more addictive opioids in the same way that methadone is used as a treatment for opioid dependence. Buprenorphine is a controlled substance, and it is considered to be an addictive drug, but it is not as addictive as other opioids, in part because it's not a full opioid agonist. There are at least 4 known opioid receptors: the opioid mu receptor, the opioid kappa receptors, the opioid delta receptors, and the opioid zeta receptors. The prevailing theory on opioid addiction is that only activation of the opioid mu receptors causes euphoria. It's believed that the activation of the other opioid receptors has nothing to do with the addictiveness of opioids. And buprenorphine is only a partial agonist of the opioid mu receptors. A partial agonist does activate a receptor, but only partially, and it also acts as a competitive antagonist. It acts as a competitive antagonist because it occupies receptors that could otherwise be occupied by full agonists, such as natural endorphins or other opioids. For this reason, it's believed that the effects of buprenorphine level off after you get to a certain point, and therefore you can only get so much euphoria from taking buprenorphine at higher and higher doses. Buprenorphine also works as an antagonist at the opioid kappa receptors. Now, there are small-scale studies that have actually shown that buprenorphine is effective for depression, and there are a significant number of people who have been prescribed buprenorphine off the label for the purpose of depression. I believe that a lot of the initial enthusiasm behind this drug came from the fact that there are a lot of people out there who have been taking buprenorphine off the label for the treatment of depression and say that it's effective. But the thing is, ALKS was not simply buprenorphine. ALKS combined buprenorphine with samidorphan. Samidorphan is a proprietary molecule owned by Alkermes that is an opioid antagonist. The purpose of combining samidorphan with buprenorphine in ALKS 5461 is to cancel out any effect that buprenorphine has as a partial agonist of the opioid mu receptors in order to prevent this medication from being addictive at all. And according to Alkermes, the theory behind it is that the antidepressant effects of buprenorphine are due to the fact that it is actually an opioid kappa antagonist. There is evidence that activation of the opioid kappa receptor can cause depression and dysphoria, and that's why it's believed that an antagonist at the opioid kappa receptor can actually work as an antidepressant. The problem with this line of thinking is it's not really that clear that buprenorphine's antidepressant effects are entirely due to the fact that it's an opioid antagonist at the opioid kappa receptors. it's quite possible that at least part of its antidepressant effects is because it's actually an opioid mu partial agonist. And thus, when you combine buprenorphine with a drug that is designed to cancel out part of the effects of buprenorphine, you do run the risk of canceling out the antidepressant effects of buprenorphine as well. Alkermes had conducted 3 phase 3 randomized controlled trials of ALKS 5461, but in January of 2016, they announced that 2 of these trials actually failed to meet their endpoints. To give you an idea of how important this medication is considered to Alkermes' financial future, in just one day, its stock went down by 55% on that bad news. Then, in October of 2016, Alkermes announced that the 3rd trial actually succeeded. Richard Pops, the CEO of Alkermes, was rather dishonest when he discussed why the antidepressant ALKS 5461 failed 2 trials. He claimed that it was not that the antidepressant was ineffective, it's just that in those 2 trials, the placebo was just as effective, or actually slightly more effective. But the truth is, if a medication is no more effective than a placebo, that means that the medication itself is not effective. That's because things like depression do benefit from the placebo effect, and if a medication isn't any better at improving people's depression than simply a placebo, then that means the medication itself is just a placebo. In October of 2016, Alkermes announced that the 3rd phase 3 trial of ALKS 5461 actually was successful.
So when the study failed in January, we looked at the data, and the data always tells you the truth. And in those data, we saw a clear signal of activity of 5461. We just hadn't designed the trial exactly the right way.
Statements like that are a little misleading. It is true that Alkermes did have 1 successful phase 3 trial after it had 2 unsuccessful ones. And it is true that in the past, the FDA has actually approved medications that have failed multiple phase 3 trials. There was 1 SSRI antidepressant that had 4 unsuccessful phase 3 trials before it had 2 successful ones, and it was actually approved by the FDA. However, in the past, the FDA has always required that a medication have at least 2 successful phase 3 trials, and this medication only had 1 successful phase 3 trial. Alkermes was expecting the FDA to somehow make an exception for them and approve this medication even though it's only got 1 successful phase 3 trial. But the other thing about all of these trials is that Alkermes used a very dishonest technique to manipulate the statistics. These studies used a technique called sequential parallel comparison design, or SPCD. SPCD is just a fancy-sounding form of data manipulation. An SPCD study has 2 phases. In the first stage, just like in ordinary trials, they have 2 groups. One group is given a placebo, and the other group is given the actual medication that's being tested. In the second stage, however, they remove all the people who responded well to the placebo in the first stage, thereby artificially reducing the placebo effect. The problem is, even though there are some people that will respond very well to placebos, there are also people that respond well to placebos that are taking the actual medication. Because for something like depression, even if a medication is effective, at least part of the effect of an actually effective medication is simply the placebo effect. So if they find that a placebo on average reduces people's depression symptoms by 20%, but the actual medication reduces people's depression symptoms by 30%, that means that 2/3 of the effects of the actual medication is simply the placebo effect, although there is still the 1/3 that is not. One of the reasons that we have placebo-controlled trials is so we know just how much of the beneficial effect coming from a medication is actually due to the effects of the medication and how much is simply due to the placebo effects. And this sort of statistical manipulation is unscientific and dishonest because It removes the people who respond well to the placebo effect from the placebo group, but it does not remove people who respond well to the placebo effect from the group actually taking the medication. So this method artificially lowers the placebo effect and gives the illusion that a medication is actually more effective than it actually is. Although there have been published SPCD studies done on medications that have already been approved by the FDA, ALKS was the first time a pharmaceutical company actually used SPD studies for the studies actually submitted to the FDA for the purpose of getting the drug approved. And this was considered something of a test case to see if the FDA would be willing to accept this form of data manipulation. I don't think the FDA should allow pharmaceutical companies to get away with this, and I'm glad that, at least in this case, the FDA has not allowed it. Now, even though the FDA has rejected Alkermes' application, it's still possible that this drug could be approved. For one thing, Alkermes is appealing the decision, and they plan on meeting with the FDA for more guidance pretty soon. Also, it's possible that the Alkermes could redo clinical trials, and if they're successful, could resubmit them to the FDA and get this medication approved. However, right now, it's not looking too good. I believe that the FDA made the right decision in this case, and I do hope that in the future, the FDA does not accept SPCD trials as valid trials for approving of medications. This is not about increasing the options for people who suffer from depression. This is about the fact that approving a medication that is expensive and useless for depression might be beneficial for pharmaceutical companies like Alkermes and for psychiatrists, but it's actually detrimental to people who are actually suffering from depression. So if you like this video, go ahead and give it a like, and if you haven't already, subscribe to my channel, click the bell icon for notifications, join the Zork Army, and together we shall take over the world. I upload 5 videos a month. You can also follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Snapchat at ZorkBid123, and I broadcast at ZorkBid123 on Twitch and Younow.